you know, and you come in with that 2 tons of fruit. Whereas this year, you know, we've got real crops, and that's a great start. Yeah.
Cool.
You know, that we've had it's been really cool and a fair bit of rain, but we're now into this beautiful kind of long sort of 30-degree days, you know, 12, 13-degree nights. It's perfect.
Conditions.
Yeah. Everyone's pretty happy. Yeah.
Good.
As long as the fires stay away. In fact, I shouldn't even use the bloody word, right?
Well, I feel like we're fairly safe this year because there's been so much, you know, the ground's still wet, really.
Right.
So
Okay.
grass is still green. Well, that can change quickly, but I feel like we've dodged the bushfire bullet this year.
Excellent.
Yeah.
That's a decent break. All right, it's 7 o'clock. Let's kick off. Steve, thanks so much for joining us tonight, and Samantha from Giant Steps. I'm very encouraged by not only the number of people here tonight, the number of new people who have never been online with us before. I think that shows a really great increase in interest in Giant Steps as a brand, and I'm super excited to welcome so many new people. It was quite an interesting day getting all the couriers delivered to the right addresses on time to people who haven't tasted with us before, but I think it's all gone quite well. So by way of introduction, Steve was gourmet traveler, winemaker of the year in 2018. I understand that you're a keen skier, Steve. My forte is more après ski, and in fact, some people would say it's more like a Kelvinator on 2 planks going down a ski slope. So clearly, you have more talent in that regard than me.
Not sure about that, but yeah.
Some background, other wineries that you've worked at, Lewin Estate and Hardy's. And I understand you're also the Len Evans wine show judge, or one of the Len Evans wine show judges. Guys, what I'm going to ask Steve to do tonight, because we've got this opportunity to really look seriously at three or four different sites, is to line up all your Chardonnays together. So number 1 being the Sexton, number 2 being the Applejack, and number 3 being the Tarraford. And maybe Steve can just talk us through a little bit about the orientation differences. We're certainly going from 100 to 200 meters in number 1 to 320, really high altitude in number 2, the Applejack, and then back down to 100 with Tarraford. So maybe I can hand over to you from there, Steve.
Yeah, sure thing. I mean, it's a nice way to taste them, because the winemaking, you know, for us it's pretty straightforward. There's nothing particularly complicated about it. You know, the fruit's hand-picked. It's sort of sorted and selected as it's picked, and then put over a sorting table, and then it's whole bunch pressed. It then goes into a nice bunch of large oak vessels for a natural fermentation. So that's pretty simple stuff. But the really important thing for us is the vineyard sites themselves. So in some ways, the winemaking is the control, and the vineyard is the variable in this scientific experiment you're about to do, which is good fun.
In terms of clones, mate, are they various clones or clonal mixes?
There are mixes, but I don't think that's that significant, to tell you the truth. I think the more significant thing is the actual dirt and the orientation and the aspect that, you know, the vines are planted on, because we did find clones, you know, clones being different types of Chardonnay. We did find big differences in when the vines were young. You know, they were significant, but now it's like as the vines are settling into that 25, 30 years of age, they're becoming much more about the site. And that's really quite interesting and quite good fun, I think. Yeah,
that's really cool. I hear that from the Burgundians quite a bit, that this obsession with Dijon clones and what have you. At some sort of point, they really are just a portal of the terroir. They're really just a means to feed the fruit.
It's like they become, you know, they become their surroundings after a while. And and that's, you know, I don't know. It's kind of nice, that, I reckon. Yeah. But you know, I remember James Milton, a guy a New Zealand winemaker who's a mad organic biodynamicist, makes beautiful wine, grows beautiful fruit. And he said to me a couple of years ago, we were actually judging a show together. He said, you know, people walk into a vineyard and they look up and they see vines and sky and mountains and aspect, and they bang on about that stuff. But he said, I look at I think about what's going on underneath that vine. There's another entire world, you know, going on below the surface of the ground, and obviously the root system. And it really got me thinking that, you know, these 3 vineyards they're on significantly different sites, different altitudes, as you mentioned, but they're all sitting on quite different dirt as well. And, you know, what's important is probably even what's below that dirt. When you go down 2 or 3 meters, you know, and the vine roots really don't go down that far. They're they're going into different sort of territory, and they're discovering different minerals, and they're accessing different sort of amounts of water. And, you know, some of them are going directly, more sort of vertically, and that's probably more relevant in the Pinots we'll talk about in a second. But, you know, these are the Chardonnays are planted on fairly tough sites. So they're made to work for their living, really. And I think that mild amount of stress on Chardonnay vines, where they have to really go down deep to find nutrient and water, tends to make wines that have a bit more kind of mineral, a bit more length, a bit more elegance, a bit more phenolic, a bit more tannin.
Right.
And when I look at that, the Sexton Chardonnay in particular, I really do see this sort of structure and mouthfeel, and it's basically tannin and phenolics that comes out of the grapes, and that, you know, that comes from being grown on a fairly tough site, really.
It's super interesting to see this, because what I was saying to Steve just before we actually kicked off was, had I thought about this, had I known just how they were going to show tonight, I would have shown them completely in the juxtaposition. I'd shown the Tarraford first, then the Applejack, and then Sexton, because for me, Sexton is just this big, majestic, ultra rich, really lavish kind of nose. And the Applejack for me is more about sort of green apple, fairly structured, but starting to change. And the Tarraford certainly the quieter of the three in terms of the phenolics.
No, I think you've absolutely nailed it. That's exactly how I see them too, really. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let's have a.
You know,
Yep.
The Sexton being on a fairly, you know, shallow topsoil, a little bit of ironstone, we call it duplex soil. The grapes tend to be a bit smaller across the bunches. So when you've got a smaller grape, you've got a higher amount of skin to juice ratio, and they naturally tend to be a bit more tannin and phenolic. Yeah, and I think that's has quite a big effect on that Sexton Chardonnay. And
I'm really liking that the mid palate is sort of starting to ease its way, sort of, you know, in the middle, starting to sort of broaden and fatten. Without doubt, this is early days for the wine. Some of the critics seem to have found a chalkiness in the wine, but I'm not seeing that tonight in particular.
Yep.
Maybe it's just the glass.
Yeah, it's a lovely food wine, that one. You know, it's got a lot of phenolic, and it's got a really lovely fresh acidity. I mean, none of these wines get adjusted for acidity. They just, you know, naturally the Yarra Valley produce kind of relatively high acid Chardonnays that have an incredible cellaring potential. And I reckon that Sexton Vineyard Chardonnay could comfortably go into the cellar for 10, 15 years. And it'll be a beautiful wine. Yeah.
Rob, to your point, I think the Sexton is texturally different.
Very much. Yeah.
If you look at it, it's got this sort of oiliness to it. It's got that viscosity to it, for want of a better word, that the other two don't have.
Correct.
A bit of grunt and muscle, sort of. Very different. And what's that from, Steve? Is that from the location or the particular soil, or what?
No, I reckon viscosity is a really beautiful word. And for me, you know, the wines are very much about you know, lovely aromas, and there's an amount, you know, an importance to the flavor. But for me, you know, Chardonnay's mouthfeel is a really important component. And the reason why the Sexton has more viscosity, more of a velvety mouthfeel, is I think a combination of those small berries and higher white tannin. But also all of these wines have been through what we call indigenous or wild fermentation. So wild fermentation tends to produce another level of tertiary alcohol. So they produce alcohol, but they produce these lovely mouth-filling, creamy, thick textural elements in the wine as well. And that's why we, you know, take the risk in wild fermentation, because the benefit is so amazing. You know, the prize is so good. Yeah.
I'm quite interested going from the sort of the 150 to 200 meter altitude to the Applejack, which is, I think that's your highest altitude single vineyard of everything that Giant Steps has. Am I right with that? Was there a higher one?
One more, a little bit higher, one called Wombat Creek, which is 400.
Oh, Wombat.
Yeah, but we only make a tiny amount of that wine.
Tiny a bit,
Yep. So, but 320 in the Yarra Valley is regarded as pretty high. You know, it's not only the height, but also it's on this lovely northeast facing aspect, but it's surrounded at the top end of the vineyard by a temperate rainforest. And if you can imagine at night time, the cold air descending through that forest and then falls down through the vines, and that tends to have an even more dramatic temperature drop at night time. So while the Sexton Vineyard at night time might be 12 or 13 degrees, Applejack will be 9 or 10 degrees Celsius. Wow. Yeah, and that's big, because that's big on acid retention, dragging the ripening season out a bit further. and giving us this really fine, and you correctly said, I see this sort of green apple character in that wine as well.
I think that there's actually, for me, more tension in the Applejack. There's something sort of coiled that is definitely waiting to expand and develop. I think the money maker for me in the Applejack at this stage is a sense of purity and cleanness. The wine has this beautiful, clean. I'm trying to think of an analogy to sort of maybe even some of the Chardonnays that I find at the super high altitude in Centro Otago. It reminds me of that sort of super fine, clean, schisty kind of a component.
Yeah, it's almost schisty, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. Derek is asking a question: is there a difference in malolactic fermentation that accounts for the differences in the Chardonnays?
Good question. None of these wines have been through malolactic fermentation, Derek, and that's because we like that kind of fresh acidity. And I think if these wines had gone through malolactic fermentation, they probably would lose a little bit of that kind of length and minerality and elegance. Yeah. If they wanted to go through Malo, if they spontaneously went through Malo, that would be okay with it.
Right.
Yeah. And the Wombat Creek, just on that point, did go through Malo because it was so much malic acid. It just wanted to.
Just naturally wanted to sing the blues.
Wanted to be wines want to go through an alcoholic fermentation and a Malo fermentation to become stable, and that's what natural fermentation is all about. So these go through an alcoholic fermentation, but then they stop. So once they settle down, the wine becomes clear. We put them to bed. Yeah. Am
I right? Over the years, I always thought the marker for picking up Malo in a Chardonnay was a certain butterscotch or dulce de leche kind of flavor in the back palate. Am I right about that? As a sort of telltale trigger that there's been artificial Malo, the wine's been put through additional Malo?
Yeah, I think if you put a Chardonnay through Malo and you stop it in the middle of Malo, you really do bind in that buttery, diacetyl, cheesy character, almost yogurty. But if malolactic fermentation happens naturally, they tend to go right through. It tends to really just reduce the acidity and give you a bit more sort of creamy mouthfeel without necessarily any flavor compounds. So, there's Malo and Malo.
Yeah, got it.
Yeah.
And now I'm super interested to read about the Tarraford, because you're 100 meters above sea level. So really, I guess Yarra Valley floor, would that be right? It wouldn't.
Yeah, it's right in that there's a ridge going between Healesville and Yarra Glen, right through the middle of the Yarra, and it's on the southeast facing side of that small ridge. It's a really it's a mature vineyard. It's 35 years old. It was planted for sparkling base back in the 80s. And we came along in 2004 and we leased the entire vineyard now. And we grow Chardonnay on the south-facing slope and Syrah, Carignan, Grenache on the north-facing slope. So it's a really interesting place. Yeah.
In reading the tasting notes and trying to do a bit of homework ahead of this, you seem to place more score on north-facing slopes in the Yarra. Is there a reason for that? Just from your writing, it seems to be something.
Yeah, historically, the north-facing slopes were planted because they had the most amount of sunlight. If you can imagine, the sun goes from the northeast to the northwest. So if you're facing north, you're getting sunlight all day. And back in the 90s, that was important because, the Yarra Valley was regarded as a pretty cold place. Yeah,
not so much anymore.
Nowadays, we're sort of going, let's plant some Chardonnay on the south-facing slope and see what happens. Yeah. And they're pretty interesting slopes. Yeah.
Right. So in terms of daylight hours, are you actually changing the way you think in terms of exposure to sun as a rule in terms of?
For sure. I mean, we're planting new vineyards at the moment and we're planting them on a slightly different aspect. We're doing a bit more east-west rows to try and get a bit more shading. We're having closer planting, so we're getting more shading from the vine next door. We are running the cordon lower to the ground for that same effect, trying to keep a cooler little microclimate, where the fruit zone is. And we're definitely looking at south-facing slopes that we would not have considered 30 years ago.
Okay, that's interesting. The Tarraford thing as well, it seems that you speak about Tarraford being in a very specific mesoclimate for its altitude, where it's much cooler than its surrounding vineyard. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that tiny little spot.
This sort of south-facing it's almost in a crater, but almost like an amphitheater. Right. Where we're seeing, morning sun, but we're not seeing much afternoon sun there. So it seems to be a really special spot for Chardonnay. Yeah. Some people have described the Tarraford Chardonnay as almost like Chablisian or Chablis-like, and I think it's, I don't like using the French kind of comparisons.
Yeah, I think it's un-Australian, right?
Yeah, I do kind of think that is the one. Surprisingly, it's got this lovely white floral character, and it's consistent every year. That white flowers I see in that wine, a little bit of citrus as well. Yeah,
it's the striking part for me right now with that Tarraford is its neatness. It's kind of everything is in place, everything is well structured, and that seems to echo the previous vintages that we've done. I think, gosh, we must have done 5 or 6 different vintages of this over the years with you guys.
15, yeah, over year with you guys,
yeah. It seems to be a really specific stamp, an architectural stamp on that particular site.
Yeah, it's got a bit of a following, and also, you're right. It's the one. The Tarraford seems to go into bottle and look beautiful straight away, and the Applejack and the Sexton take a little bit of time to relax. Yeah. So I don't know what that is, but Tarraford often wins trophies. If we put it into wine shows, it does very well. Yeah. It's really popular at cellar door. A lot of people will come in and they'll go straight for the Tarraford Chardonnay. That's the one they take home.
I can sort of see that because it's immediacy. It delivers everything in one place immediately. So this,
pretty yummy.
It's got that. You open it and drink it. Whereas I'm super excited to see what 1 and 2 do in 2 to 3 years, knowing what I've had in the past with you.
Yeah. And you start putting food with these wines and they change again too. I mean, I love that. The Applejack with that searing acidity, you put that with a piece of, soft set curd goat's cheese. One of those lovely white firm goat's cheeses, and it really slices through it. It's great.
Yeah, it's amazing. All right, before we kick on to the Pinots, are there any questions for Steve on the rest of the Chardonnays, or we can always do it later if anyone's... in terms of, there's one in private chat on production levels of these 3. I know that the sites are dramatically different in size.
Yeah, the biggest, the one we make the most of is the Sexton Chardonnay, because that's got the most amount of vineyard. There's about, we've got about 9 or 10 hectares of Chardonnay at Sexton Vineyard. And so we've got a few different plots to play with there, and not every one of them makes the single vineyard wine, but we make it generally probably about 1,000 cases of the Sexton Chardonnay for the world. Applejack's tiny. Well, it's about 250 cases if we're lucky. Yeah. And the Tarraford somewhere between sort of 300 and 400 cases each year.
Yeah, we sort of found over the years that the Sexton Sexton Chardonnay is probably the most popular here with our clients. Yeah. But the Applejack Pinot has found to be the most popular on the Pinot side by sales. And for me personally, I love the Wombat if it's got some extra years on it. It's very, very quiet in early release, but the further and further back you go with Wombat, the more of a story it's got to tell. I really love it. I really love that label.
Yeah, you mean the Pinot? Wombat
the Pinot, Pinot, yeah.
Yeah, it's always pretty out there. I mean, that's a really high, very cold site, and there are years when we don't get fruit ripe up there. It's pretty marginal. So when it does get ripe and we make a wine, we only make a wine when it gets ripe. It's pretty spectacular. It's pretty special. Yeah.
It's definitely not a site for the shareholders.
Yeah, that's right. No, the accountant hates it. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's have a look at the noses now of the others in terms of how we did the decanting today. Again, I'm getting more and more bold with letting the wines breathe before I seal them up and put argon on them to courier them to people. So today, again, it was about an hour and a half open in the jars and a large decant before we sealed them up.
And so we're going to go Sexton, Applejack, Primavera.
Sexton, Applejack, and Primavera.
Yeah.
So the Primavera is kind of between Sexton and Applejack at 240 meters. I'm not sure of the orientation on it. Certainly, these 3, if one's going to chase the points, it's Applejack. And I think as a trend, Applejack's been the one over the years that's certainly been the big performer in the very, very highest percentile. I've got to say that what I'm getting tonight, Steve, on the phenolics is again Sexton's giving me more at this stage.
Yeah, I mean it is it's a warmer site, Sexton, and warmer because not necessarily temperature wise. alone, it actually sees a bit more sunlight than the other two vineyards. It is facing north, the Sexton vineyard, so it's getting that northeast, northwest. On the eastern side in the morning, on the western side in the Arvo, we try and expose fruit a little bit, so we avoid, sort of having this sort of dense fruit zone that, in a cool year like this year where it gets a bit, the rainfall's higher, we can pick up some issues from sort of having bunches too close together. So we allow quite a bit of air and light to pass through those canopies. And it consequently, when grapes response to sunlight is to produce more color and more tannin. It's like their sunscreen. So naturally, the Sexton vineyard carries a bit more color, and with that comes more tannin as well. Yeah.
I guess the salient point is that the Applejack is the only one that's close planted, right?
Yeah, closer. It's like about 4,000 vines worth.
Sorry, I was interrupted. So 4,000 vines per hectare, is it?
Yeah, and Sexton's about 2,200 vines per hectare. So yeah, it's almost double.
Dramatic difference in exposure to sunlight. It's going to totally redefine how the wine tastes in so many ways.
Oh yeah, I mean, when you start absolutely, when you start putting vines closer together, they compete. They're competing for the same nutrients, so they're producing less fruit per vine. And part of the reason we do it is so that each vine is responsible for a lower amount of fruit to ripen.
Right.
And that means one root system that's going all that down through the ground doing all that work is only responsible for ripening maybe 1.5 kilos of fruit. Whereas on the more sort of specially planted vineyards, you've got a vine responsible for producing a bit more fruit. So there's an argument that the competition is a bit more intense on the closer planted sites. They're working a bit harder. They're going into a mild amount of stress. They're responsible for less fruit, so they're doing a better job with it. But I think more significantly than those two things, because they're both pretty theoretical, when you put vines closer together, you create a microclimate that's cooler and a little bit more humid than when their vines are further apart. And that's by more shading going on and basically having, just a bit more humidity kept in this sort of little environment. It's almost like a forest, if you can imagine that.
Yeah.
That means that the ripening humidity and temperature and length of time that the grapes are sitting on the vine is different as well. And when you just slow that process down a bit, everything happens in a different sort of state. And sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes that's a bad thing. And sometimes you don't know it for 10 or 15 years till you've planted the vineyard. It turns out. So Applejack just seems to kind of work. And there's something about that vine density on a northeast facing slope on a fairly steep site too, surrounded by temperate rainforest. All of those things seem to contribute to growing really lovely Pinot Noir.
What I'm maybe getting on out of the Applejack tonight, and I'm having been in love with this wine for many vintages, what I'm finding the most interesting is the palate. There's this kind of stoniness on the palate, a certain promise of depth. And at the moment, for me, the texture is the thing that I'm most excited about with Applejack. I kind of know that it's going to build around that in the fullness of time, because that's what Applejack does. It needs another 18 months in the darkness of the cellar to really come out and show what it can do. But I'm really loving just that sort of, definitely that stony gravity component, which is not something that I've seen very often in Applejack. It's something that is quite different this time. At this stage of its age.
Yeah, you know what I love most about tasting Pinots, and particularly tasting with guys like you, who when we tasted the same wines on a semi-regular basis, and they go on a bit of a roller coaster ride, and you taste it one day, and then I taste these wines every week, and I still see differences in that Applejack Pinot every time I try it. But I agree. What I'm finding really exciting tonight about that wine is, and it's the classic Pinot thing. It's a pale, soft, red. Yeah. You look at it, you smell it, and it's got lots of lovely aromas. But then you put it in your mouth, and it just fills up. It's got this lovely, dense, creamy, velvety thing going on, and I love the way Pinot just kind of surprises you like that. That's why we just keep getting so excited about this variety.
Well, I just I as I get older, I eat less and less protein, animal protein. But I'm just thinking duck with this Applejack. Geez, it's like a match in heaven, right? It's just
particularly duck with a bit of spice on the skin that's been roasted really crispy.
Or something.
I love it with that one, because that's almost got a bit of an exotic kind of oriental spice.
There's a kind of Robert Parker would say kinkiness, like that kinky spice component, but I think it's more a 5-spice component. He often references that sort of spice profile, and it's definitely there. I think that Halliday, or the person who writes for Wine Companion now, spoke about a jazziness in the wine, and I think it's the spice that he's referencing when he talks about that. Really beautiful.
It's also
Steve, due to a processing and concentration error here at my house, we've just mixed Sexton and Applejack, and I've got to recommend it. It's a bloody good blend. It works really.
Okay. You got to try. Yeah.
The Ghirardello blend. I can see it.
Yeah,
we've got to talk about that.
Major pressure here to get everything right.
You've just put Chambol Mussini with Gevrey Chambon, but whatever.
Yeah, that'll be fine.
They're close enough. Sorry.
Yeah.
Which begs the question: in your estate wine, for which vintage are we looking at next? 2020, I think, is the next vintage, because 19's out the flash, right?
Yep.
How do you determine your mix for your estate blend? Is it different every year, or predetermined, or how do you do that?
No, it's not predetermined. It's an interesting process. I mean, every vineyard every parcel of fruit gets fermented separately, and it's kept separate, right up until about August. So for about 6 months, and we have generally between 45 and 50 batches of Pinot in the winery in little barrel groups. We taste them all in their vineyards. So we'll line up all the Applejack components, all the Sexton components, all the Tarraford components, all the Wombat Creek components, and we'll taste them in their vineyard, and we'll pull forward the ones that have probably the most amount of personality, or the ones that are really striking wines, but also really speak of their place. And we'll do that over 3 separate sessions: one in August, one in usually September, and one 1st of October. Then we make the call to put together the single vineyard wines, and all the remaining parcels go together to make up the Yarra. And it's just almost by chance that every year it's pretty much right across all vineyards, tends to be, roughly the same proportion. So it's usually sort of 20%, 20%, 20%, 20% from.
Rob and I often have this discussion with winemakers, especially Pinot winemakers. Yeah, the fascination for the consumer market for single vineyards, but the fullness that you get from selecting parcels from every wine, it ends up very often the blend ends up being much more satisfying from an end perspective. But what's your view on that? Do you have a favorite?
I've got a big record collection, and I've got a lot of albums, and I've got a lot of best ofs as well, and I like them both.
And nothing better than the mixtapes, right?
Mixtape, yeah.
In my place,
Putting those blends together is great fun. It's like putting together a jigsaw sometimes, and sometimes they just fall together, and sometimes you actually have to work pretty hard. So I was being a bit flippant before saying all the rest goes in, because that's what we try first of all, but sometimes that doesn't work. So we'll pull things out, try some more things in there, change the blend. We've got a place to move wine to that we're not really happy with. So if there's a parcel of wine we don't like, we get rid of it. And so only the really good stuff goes in. And so we've got a chance to play around a bit with that sort of thing. But that's good fun. Yeah. But
I'm really enjoying the Primavera as the final one. And what's so different for me from the first 2 Pinots is the silky texture. It's just really sort of Bond kind of esque. Sorry, again, borrowing the wrong French words, but the texture on the Primavera is a big win for me. I really like it, particularly in the front palate. It's really, really beautiful. It's got a silky evolution to it that the other 2 don't echo at this stage.
Yeah, I see lots of musk in that wine too. It's got quite an exotic nose, and that seems to be part of the vineyard kind of DNA. But lots of whole bunch fermentation in that wine, and I think that texture you're referring to is partly the whole bunch fermentation is responsible for that to a degree, I think.
Right.
With that carbonic or semi-carbonic maceration, it again, like wild fermentation, produces a lot more things than just alcohol. There's a bunch of tertiary things going on, and they are all mouth-filling characters too. So. In an area where we don't have a great deal of tannin naturally, the Yarra Valley, we have lots of perfume, not much tannin. That texture from the stem fermentation and bunch fermentation is a really important thing for us.
It's interesting because I've always aligned whole bunch fermentation with a far more tannic wine, something that gives you, certainly at an earlier stage, way more grip than this. I think I'm really loving its softness and its agility at such an early stage. It's interesting because I remember once I was on Waiheke Island at a really, really expensive producer's vineyard, and he was banging on about, only the grapes go into our press, and it's gravity fed, and it's got to go left instead of right, and all this organic stuff. But I actually thought the wine was missing something. It was just so much, speaking of the fruit, it seemed like there was an element that wasn't there. So I'm very often a little bit skitterish when people say, oh, we only grape press, we don't go anywhere near the stalks and the bunches. I think there's an element to that, even in Pinot.
Yeah, I mean, and we don't just we're not dogmatic about whole bunch fermentation. I really love it, and that's probably my history in over in Beaujolais. I love the wines from over there, but when a bunch of grapes is finally picked and it comes into the winery, the first thing we do is we go out and start chewing the stalks, and if the stalks are green like bell pepper or capsicum, we won't do whole bunch. But if they are more, almond skin, a bit more kind of, that sort of riper barky character, a bit like cinnamon bark, then we will go, well, that's probably a good contender for whole bunch. They've got to be ripe stalks.
That's interesting, because I've actually seen winemakers doing that, and to be honest, the first time I saw somebody do that in New Zealand, I thought he was picking his teeth. Clearly, there's far more attached to this chewing of stalks that I'd ever given.
And what's interesting is it's the colder, higher vineyards that tend to have the riper stalks. And I think there's no science behind this, but I think it's because the longer ripening process being higher and colder, the stalk ripeness tends to get a chance to catch up to the grape skin and sugar ripeness. That's like they align a bit better. Whereas if you have a Pinot growing in a warmer part of the valley, often the flavors and the sugars have more elevated ahead of the stalks themselves. So we tend to favor more whole bunch in the cooler sites. Yeah. Right.
There's a question. Can you advise the alcohol differences between these three? I'd say much of them. Really.
They're about the same. I think the Sexton is probably slightly higher at about 13.6, I think, 13.7, but I think they're hovering between 13 and 13.5. Yeah.
Really loving the Primavera. That polish, there's a just in the top of my palate, that polish is so great right now. I think it's just in the right spot.
Yeah, I'm thinking, if the Applejack's sort of making you think about roast duck, for me, the Primavera is more almost white flesh, like I don't really like char grilled quail with that wine.
Maybe veal if you're into it, or that, or pork,
maybe that.
Or something like that.
Yeah, and pork definitely. Barbecue pork could be really good with that, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, or loose porchetta. The Italian pork is great. No, the porchetta, in Italy they give it to you on the roadside with rosemary and salt. That's fantastic. So Dave's asking, are all the Pinots whole bunch fermentation?
There's elements of whole bunch in all of them. Yeah, but probably the most amount of whole bunch would be in the Primavera, I think. Yeah, from memory.
Yeah, Dave, you're saying that the 19 Primavera is very similar to the 18. I agree. I think I'm more excited about the 19 just for where it sits right now. I just love its gloss. I think it's really, I'm really in love with it tonight.
Yeah, so the 20s.
Before we let Steve go to bed, it's getting late in Australia. None from everybody. Steve, thanks so much. Oh, I'm going to ask the question that Lou normally asks. What are you drinking at home other than Giant Steps at the moment?
Well, today, my annual allocation of the Stefan Tissot wines came in from a mate of ours who brings them in. And there he's an amazing Jura producer of Chardonnay. I think he's probably the greatest Chardonnay producer in the entire world. Really? So that's what I'm drinking tonight. Yeah. But, everything, we drink a lot of each other's wines in the Yarra. We swap wines a lot. There's almost always, our fridge has got 2 or 3 Yarra Valley Chardonnays in it at the moment. And, there's plenty of Yarra Pinot kicking around the house as well. So, but, what's great, vintage time. We're in the middle of vintage now, everybody. And we try and taste a couple of wines every day, with the group. We've got a bunch of casual young kids there and do some options and stuff like that. So there's plenty going on. Yeah.
So one more question before we let you go. Growing season in 18 versus 19. Sounds like 19 was a longer, cooler, more relaxed. Anyway, I'll let you comment.
No, bang on. 18 was relatively warm, I think. If you look at the temperature accumulation, and everyone talks about 18 as being the kind of warm, cuddly vintage. The wines are really delicious. I don't know if they're going to be wines that last forever, but they're just beautiful as young wines. 19's longer and cooler, and I think those wines are going to be more long-lived as a result of that. They seem to be carrying a bit more length and elegance and thickness, and
I hesitate to the sort of white shoe salesman of in my personality says like 19's an icon vintage, but I'm so excited about how expressive they are as different sites at this early stage. Thinking of 18 when we opened them a year ago at the same stage, I'm actually super excited to be able to move these 18s along in the market for you.
Look, we're so lucky. We've had 3 really spectacular years. 17, 18, 19 are 3 of the best years I've seen in a row ever. So and you guys enjoy them. 20's going to be interesting, but there's just so little 20 wine around.
But when winemakers use the word interesting, I get super nervous.
Interesting, good, but we just get nervous because we've got like 50 and 100 cases instead of 250 cases. So
Gotcha. Well, Steve, all the best. Thank you so much for joining us, and maybe somewhere in the year we can get together and do some verticals. Maybe look at one of these single vineyards over a couple of vintages.
That'd be great. We'll do Applejack. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, it'll be exciting. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Personally, I'm a big fan of the Syrah as well, so I'd love to have a look at that in the future.
Okay.
That'd be awesome. I'd love it.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Cheers, Lou. Good on you.
Yeah, mate. Thank you. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good night.
Good night.
Let me turn off the recording here.